This reading is an excerpt from an op-ed published in Native News Online in 2015, written by Mark Charles, a member of the Diné people, or as we say in English, the Navajo Nation. It is entitled, The Dilemma of the 4th of July. The other day I was eating dinner with my wife in a restaurant located in Gallup, New Mexico, a border town to the Navajo Reservation. Gallup was recently named Most Patriotic Small Town in a nationwide contest. Soon after sitting down, I noticed that we were seated at a table directly facing a framed poster of the Declaration of Independence. The irony almost made me laugh. When our server, who was also Native, came to the table, I asked if I could show him something. Then I stood up and pointed that 30 lines below the famous quote, "All men are created equal," the Declaration of Independence refers to Natives as merciless Indian savages. The server was concerned that I might be upset, so after our dinner, the manager of the restaurant came to our table and asked if everything was okay. I showed her the quote and assured her that I was not trying to cause problems. After more than a decade of living on the Navajo Nation, I become used to such offenses when I travel outside our reservation. After the manager left, I noticed that another Native couple seated near us had taken interest in our conversation. So I invited them over and showed them the same offensive line hanging over our table. They were astounded that throughout their entire education, they were never told that the Declaration referred to Natives in such a way. If the poster had labeled any other group of people as savage, or if the source of the words was anything else besides one of our country's founding documents, the restaurant in question would have long ago been sued, and the parties responsible for hanging the poster most likely disciplined. But because the targeted group was Natives, the source was the Declaration of Independence, and the responsibility for hanging the poster belonged to the restaurant's national corporate offices. Not only is the poster still hanging today, but on July 4th, the entire nation will celebrate the message of this poster and the signing of the Declaration. For we have declared it a national holiday, complete with fireworks, parades, and speeches. This is the dilemma that Native Americans face every day. The foundation of the United States of America are blatantly unjust. This land was stolen. Native peoples, Africans, and many other minority communities have long been recipients of systemic racism. And the roots of it are right there for the entire world to see, printed in many of our founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and United States Supreme Court case rulings. We announce it, we flaunt it, we celebrate it. As a nation, we embrace this history because we are largely ignorant of the true nature of our past and have never been held accountable for our actions. As Americans, we celebrate our foundations of discovery and cling to our narrative of exceptionalism because we have been taught that this nation was founded by God on a principle of freedom for all. As a nation, the United States does not share a common memory and therefore struggles to have true community. So this 4th of July, I invite every American to start their day by learning about the Doctrine of Discovery, allowing the reality of the dehumanizing nature of this doctrine to temper your celebrations. You can still light your fireworks and eat your barbecue as you celebrate a hard-fought victory over the British. But at the end of the day, I humbly ask you to conclude your celebrations with the following prayer. May God have mercy on the United States of America and give us the courage necessary to create a common memory. This Thursday, July 2nd, I was proud to be part of an event held by the Wayland Free Public Library. It was a reading of Frederick Douglass's speech before the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in 1852. Officially titled The Meaning of July 4th for the Negro, it is now universally known by a question Douglass poses in the middle of the speech. What to the slave is the 4th of July? A couple fellow members of First Parish were there as volunteer readers, and it was recorded. I will include a link on the First Parish Social Google group when it is uploaded to the Waycam YouTube page. For the event, as it usually is when recited or studied in school, Douglas's oration was abridged. In the style of the time, he spoke for at least an hour. Though the version recited on Thursday does mention the hypocrisy and falseness of American Christianity, the full speech contained much more on how American churches were fundamental to the maintenance of the slave system. He says it is a sin of omission as well as commission. If churches uniformly urged the end of slavery, as was mostly the case in Britain, the entire apparatus would collapse. The early 1850s also brought new conflict into northern states, as the Federal Fugitive Slave Act required authorities at every level to assist slave catchers in capturing those that fled bondage. Though the North had long been complicit in the slave system, running a market economy using crops grown on slave plantations, the fugitive slave law was a much more direct reminder that the United States was everywhere a slave society. Douglas states that, quote, "The fact that the church of our country, with fractional exceptions, does not esteem the fugitive slave law as a declaration of war against religious liberty implies that the church regards religion simply as a form of worship, an empty ceremony, and not a vital principle, requiring active benevolence, justice, love, and goodwill towards man. The church of our country, with fractional exceptions." In 1984, the UUA passed a resolution endorsing the usage of services of union to recognize relationships between people of the same gender. Support for marriage equality followed in 1996. It would be another decade before our friends in the United Church of Christ endorsed marriage equality in 2005. For a generation, it could be said that, with fractional exceptions, American churches did not recognize same-sex relationships as valid or worthy of equal standing with heterosexual relationships. In fact, like the churches in Douglas's time that supported the slave system, many churches were and remain hostile to all people of different sexual orientations or gender identities. Douglas does name some individuals who formed that fractional exception. The legendary Congregationalist minister Henry Ward Beecher and the Unitarian minister Samuel J. May. May had at that point been an abolitionist for 20 years, an active member of the Underground Railroad, and the year before Douglas spoke had been part of a plot that successfully helped Jerry Henry, who had freed himself and was participating in an abolitionist conference held in Syracuse, New York, to Canada after he had been apprehended by the police. This manner of direct action, where black and white abolitionists worked together to liberate slaves who had freed themselves from local and federal authorities, occurred several times in the 1850s. The most famous case came in 1854, where Anthony Burns was captured and held under heavy guard in the Boston courthouse. A crowd of 2,000 gathered, out of which came Unitarian minister Thomas Wentworth Higginson and a group of black men who used a wooden beam as a battering ram to break down the front door. The conflict, which left a U.S. Marshal dead, did not free Burns, but he was brought back south only under heavy federal guard. To be part of the fractional exception means to be unpopular, to risk danger, to be alienated from those we call friend and family. Though anti-slavery sentiment certainly increased in the decade before the Civil War, abolitionists were still targeted for violence. Susan B. Anthony and Samuel May were threatened by an angry crowd when they attempted to hold an abolitionist conference in January 1861. It took much bloodshed for abolitionism to move from Douglas's fractional exceptions to the center stage. 11 years after his address, July 4th, 1863, saw both the retreat of the Confederate Army from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and the surrender of the citadel of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. By then, the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, and the war had gone from being about restoring the Union as it was to a new order based on the end of the planter class and the freedom of millions of people held in bondage. During the Civil War, Unitarians and Universalists made heroic efforts on the battlefield, both as soldiers and as healers. The U.S. Sanitary Commission was started soon after the war by female congregants of All Souls Church in New York, and grew to become what one historian called the largest, most powerful, and most highly organized philanthropic activity that had ever been seen in America. As was typical of activist organizations of the time, it was led by men, but made a reality by groups of highly organized and motivated women. Some worked independently of any organization, such as the Universalist Clara Barton. Barton followed armies so to be as close to the battlefield as possible. In the years that followed, she helped locate and identify thousands of missing soldiers. She would go on to found the American Red Cross, and almost 2 decades after its creation, get Congress to recognize the Geneva Conventions and the neutrality of the Red Cross in war. By treating people of all nations equally, the Red Cross recognized the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Many others would enlist and fight. Thomas Wentworth Higginson would command the 1st Regiment of Black Troops, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Writing in his book, Army Life in a Black Regiment, he stated, "Till the blacks were armed, there was no guarantee of their freedom. It was their demeanor under arms that shamed the nation into recognizing them as people." Douglas was a fierce advocate for the enlistment of Black soldiers, first through speeches and editorials, but later through a personal relationship. Douglas convinced Lincoln to discard racist ideas like colonization in Africa and to authorize Black enlistment and push for a constitutional amendment banning slavery. Today, there is a new movement for abolition. At this year's General Assembly, 82% of delegates voted for member congregations to, quote, find alternatives to policing and to pursue police abolition within Unitarian Universalist justice work. UUA President, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, stated, "This moment calls for us to be prophetic and to imagine a world without policing. Black and Indigenous people and other folks of color have already created alternatives to policing because these structures don't keep them safe. We must follow the lead of those communities and imagine a world that centers collective care, community investment, and restorative justice, rather than surveillance, punishment, incarceration, and policing." This follows a similar resolution in 2018 calling for the abolition of immigration and customs enforcement. Policing has, from its inception, been tied up within the slave system and white supremacy. The slave catchers were the predecessor to modern-day police. In an age of mass incarceration, the exception of the 13th Amendment for prisoners has kept plantations and slave labor in operation. In my home state of California, prison firefighters are essential as climate change creates larger and more powerful wildfires. Yet they are paid only $1 an hour, and their status as felons makes them ineligible to serve as firefighters once released. As Mark Charles wrote, America does not have a common memory. The 4th of July does not mean the same thing, represent the same values, the same struggle for white Americans as it does for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. We talk today of taking down Confederate monuments and renaming military bases named after their generals, because it is an easier conversation to have than talking about the Jefferson Memorial or the Washington Monument. We cannot accept the defense that people were of their time when Douglass reminds us of the fractional exceptions that existed in his time and always have existed. To be the fractional exception to injustice is to reject being good enough, or to think in relative terms. For us to have justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, for us to have a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, requires a boldness that present society may find bewildering, goals that seem impossible. In the great law of the Iroquois Confederacy, a founding principle was that in every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. When it comes to climate justice, I want in my old age to be looked at by the young as having taken action that they can understand is necessary, even if it meant being a fractional exception in 2020. When we as Unitarian Universalists say that we affirm these universal principles, it means that we do, in the present moment, must be the best that we can possibly imagine. In November 1863, a national cemetery was dedicated at Gettysburg. President Lincoln was not the featured speaker, but he was wrong when he said, "The world will little know nor long remember what we say here." Whatever you may remember of the Gettysburg Address, however short you remember it to be, it's shorter than that. At 10 sentences, it would not count as an essay in my 6th grade English teacher's class. I quote from the end of address, which I believe speaks to our past, the present, and the future all at once. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from those honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The origin of that last phrase likely comes from an 1850 sermon by Theodore Parker, a minister ordained by a Unitarian whose views clashed with the Christian nature of the faith at the time, but would form much of the religious humanism that forms Unitarian Universalism today. When Douglass said that much of the church regards religion simply as a form of worship, an empty ceremony, and not a vital principle, he speaks to us today. Let our religion never be an empty ceremony. May the chalice burn bright because it speaks to the fire in our minds, our hearts, and our souls. May it be so.